As 1916 came to a close, it became obvious that the U.S. would soon be drawn into the conflict in Europe. With that in mind, the War Department began a top-to-bottom review of the entire military infrastructure. They looked at everything: equipment, armament, and personnel. One deficiency they discovered was that the nation didn't have a combat helmet. Now, originally that wasn't any big deal. In fact, helmets were almost perceived as novelty items. That perception began to change, however, when medical reports from the British and French clearly showed horrendous casualties were being caused in the trenches due to airburst artillery, shrapnel, and hand grenades. This is the story of America's development and adoption of a combat helmet. In 1917, the U.S. General Staff formed a committee to evaluate British, French, and even German helmets to assist in the design of a true American helmet. Prior to official involvement in the war, American volunteers were assisting the French Army in the Ambulance Corps. They were issued the first modern combat helmet, the Adrien, designed by French General Auguste Adrien and equipped with a distinctive American badge. General Adrien's helmet was the first helmet used by Americans in World War I. When the U.S. finally entered the conflict, those Americans serving in the Ambulance Corps were absorbed into the American military. The Adrien was a relatively thin steel helmet with a leather suspension and a leather chin strap. The helmet was evaluated for use by U.S. forces. The U.S. also evaluated the British combat helmet, which was used by the Canadians, Australians, and other Commonwealth countries. The British combat helmet, designed by John L. Brodie, was constructed of a much stronger steel and could take more punishment than the French Adrien. However, the helmet wasn't perfect, and it provided coverage only to about 1/3 of a soldier's head. The War Department even reviewed enemy combat helmets such as the German M1916. Considered by many to be the finest helmet of the war, the Stahlhelm provided exceptional coverage to a soldier's head and was very strong. The simple design of its 3 leather pad suspension was surprisingly robust and comfortable. Coupled with its leather chin strap, the helmet was very stable. The lugs on the side of the helmet could also support a 1/2-inch steel brow plate, which provided even greater protection. With both the French and the British jockeying for the American military to adopt their helmet, what truly tipped the balance was a British offer to provide 400,000 helmets to the Americans immediately. The offer was accepted, and the new helmet was designated the M1917. The adoption of the helmet was considered a stopgap measure until the Army could develop its own helmet, but in the meantime, the Army went to work seeking production bids from steel manufacturers to produce the helmet. The helmet was constructed of a special mixture of steel known as Hadfield manganese. The benefits of mixing the raw steel with 12% manganese was that the mixture was easy to work with. The shape of the combat helmet could be produced with a single draw of a huge steel die. It also didn't require the time-consuming chore of annealing or heat-treating the metal. Hadfield manganese could be shaped and would remain very strong even after being pressed. Manufacturing an M1917 helmet was no simple task. The helmet's steel shell consisted of the dome-shaped steel helmet bowl, 2 chin strap loops, 2 rivets, and a steel rim. The first step in the process was securing a 20-inch by 20-inch sheet of steel into the press. Next, the shape of the helmet was pressed into the steel and inspected. The helmets were then trimmed, and finally welders attached the helmet rim and chin strap loops to the underside of the helmet. Finally, a number was stamped into the underside of the steel shell. This number was referred to as the heat of the steel stamp. This was a control number which could be used to match the helmet up with a particular lot of steel in case defects or flaws were discovered. Once the helmet steel shells were completed, they were boxed up and shipped off to be painted and textured. The newly pressed helmets were placed on a conveyor system for finishing. The helmets were immersed in an olive drab paint and then proceeded to the next stage where fine sawdust was blown on the tacky helmets to provide a texture. This was designed to reduce glare. The helmets then received a second coat of paint. The helmet shells were then placed into a 200-degree oven to cure the paint. With just a few modifications, the US M1917 suspension was a copy of the British suspension. The primary components were a felt pad at the crown of the helmet, cotton twine mesh to provide some adjustment, oilcloth as a headband, and finally the leather chin strap which served as the primary frame of the suspension. The liner not only supported and distributed the weight of the helmet, but it also attempted to protect the soldier from injury if a projectile struck the helmet. Along the exterior of the suspension was a leather band of loops that ran the entire perimeter of the suspension. Rubber tubing was inserted into every other loop. This tube system kept the steel shell away from the soldier's head and provided some buffer in the event the helmet was struck by a bullet or shrapnel. The entire system was held in place by a single rivet punched through the crown of the helmet and through the leather chin strap assembly. This was the weak link in the helmet, for if the leather chin strap broke, the entire suspension could fall out. Helmets were tested by shooting selected lots with a 1911 .45 caliber handgun at a range of 10 feet. If the bullet penetrated the helmet, cracked it, or caused a dent deeper than 1 3/16 inches, the entire lot of helmets was rejected. This helmet is typical of a rejected helmet. A hole was punched in the rear flare and a red stripe painted across the top. They could be used in a training environment, but not in an actual combat situation. During the course of World War I, American steel companies produced 2.5 million M1917 combat helmets, the vast majority being pressed in Philadelphia. These saw use across the Army. They were used by the infantry, the tank corps, and artillery units. The helmet was far from perfect. It had many flaws. Its main problem was that its center of gravity was poor and it often flopped forward when a soldier assumed the firing position. A little-known fact is that the M1917 wasn't the only combat helmet used by U.S. forces in World War I. Members of the 93rd Infantry Division, a unit formed of African Americans, were shipped to France and outfitted with second-hand French uniforms and equipment, including the French Adrian helmet. The 93rd later adopted the silhouette of a French Adrian helmet as their divisional insignia. The M1917 combat helmet could also be used with a chainmail face shield and protective Wilmer eye shields. These were primarily used by tank crews who were exposed to lead splash. Lead splash was small particles of metal flying off the inside of a tank as the exterior was being struck by bullets. It was late in the war when the U.S. military approved the widespread use of divisional insignias for uniforms. While occasionally an individual doughboy may have painted his unit patch on his helmet, it was absolutely the exception and not the rule. The fact is, the vast majority of unit-marked helmets, camouflage-painted and souvenir helmets, were painted after the war during the occupation. In fact, some enterprising U.S. units billeted outside of port cities in France set up helmet painting and battle damage businesses. A doughboy about to return to the U.S. could stop by and have his helmet personalized, with depictions of battles, insignia, camouflage, and even battle damage. How, you might ask, did so many doughboys manage to keep their helmets? Well, the Secretary of War permitted each soldier to keep one complete combat uniform as their souvenir of participation in the Great War. While the German helmet may have been the finest combat helmet in the war, it was the soldiers wearing the M1917 and its Commonwealth cousins which won the day. The helmet design was truly the badge of the English-speaking soldier.